Hello friends, today let me talk to you about the poem Mending Wall written by Robert Frost. Robert Frost is a very popular American poet and I have already done a couple of videos on a few of his poems, and so here now I am not going to talk much about the poet. Instead, let me go straight to the poem titled Mending Wall. The poem was published in 1914 in the collection called The North of Boston. So the poem is the opening poem of the collection titled North of Boston, published in 1914. It is a poem that has 45 lines and is not divided into stanzas. It's just one long stretch of those 45 lines. And there is no rhyme at the end. It's written in blank verse. It loosely follows the iambic pentameter metric scheme. Now this poem is one of the most popular and the most anthologized poems of Robert Frost. It is a very interesting one. And Robert Frost, when we think of his poetry, one special feature about the poetry of Robert Frost is that he, of course, in most of his poem deals with nature and the various scenes in nature, and he generally talks about the New England countryside in America, where he was born and brought up, and he talks about the things happening in the farm and in the countryside, and he also talks about the people who live there. And his poems generally are thick or dense in meaning, in the sense that when he talks about something that sees around him, he is not just describing what he sees, but there is always an underlying layer of meaning. It is so fully suffused with meaning that you would, the more when you read or reread the poem, you would find several layers of meaning surfacing. So that is what is special about him. And in comparison maybe to Wordsworth, who is also known as a poet of nature, this is something that marks him apart. That Wordsworth, in his poems, he adores nature, he worships nature. Nature to him is something spiritual. But for Robert Frost, he has a very commonsensical attitude towards nature. He sees nature as a teacher that teaches valuable lessons, and he kind of makes a comparison between many things that he sees around him, and he often tries to connect them with the lives of people and how every situation can be directly linked to something that happens in our lives. And so there is a very easy connect between the poetry of Robert Frost and the reader, because he talks about things that each one of us have been through, and or at least we have seen others going through it, and it's very easy to identify ourselves with the poetry of Robert Frost. Now let's go on to the poem titled Mending Wall. Let me just read it once. Mending wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean. No one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and somehow loaves and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put the notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. So a very interesting poem that one is. And now like this, and you can see from what I read, you must have felt and sensed that it is a very conversational kind of a poem, where he seems to talk to us and he tells us, the speaker of the poem, he is telling us about what happened when he and his friend went out to mend a wall, and the conversation that happened between the two of them, and also his own musings about the idea of walls. Do we really need walls? And all such thoughts that come to his mind as they walk along the wall. So he shares all this with us, the readers. Now let's look at it, the first few lines. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. He says, I have always felt that there is something in nature that doesn't love walls, because every time in the spring season he has to repair these walls, and he finds that the upper boulders of the wall. Now when we talk about a wall here, at least this particular wall that Frost is talking about, it is not a wall made of bricks and mortar and cemented firmly together. It is just a country wall that is built between farms. It's just a long row of boulders or stones arranged in a neat long pile. There is no mortar to hold the boulders together. It's that sort of a wall. And so he says that there is something that doesn't love a wall, and that sends the frozen ground swell under it. He says in the winter, this something in nature that doesn't love walls, what does it do? Because it doesn't like walls, every winter under the frozen ground, something swells, or this dislike towards the wall, this power that doesn't like the wall, it makes the ground swell, and as a result what happens? The boulders fall off the wall and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. And sometimes he says, I have noticed that there are spacious gaps in between in certain parts of the wall, and the gaps are quite big that two people can pass abreast, means you can just stand side by side and walk through the wall. Such huge gaps. And so he says, I've been seeing this for so many years, and that is why I'm sure there is something that doesn't love a wall. The work of hunters is another thing. He says, yes, of course, one thing that can cause damage to a wall is definitely it is the passing of the hunters, because when they are hunting, sometimes they leap over the wall, maybe on their horses, and they might accidentally knock off a few boulders. Or sometimes when they see that there is a rabbit hidden somewhere in the gaps between these stones, they they rip the stones apart so that the rabbit can be caught. And so that is why he says the work of hunters is another thing. So that is a human thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. Yelping dogs here are the excited, the noisy dogs, the barking dogs that accompany the hunters. So, and we know that the dogs are very keen on the scent, and so they can smell a rabbit even if it's hiding somewhere, and they start yelping and barking loudly. And in order to please those dogs, in order to let them catch or in order to let them have the pleasure of catching a rabbit, the hunters would often move the stones of the walls so that they can pull a rabbit out of hiding. So he says that is one reason why walls get damaged. And I have often, each time a hunting party passes by, I have to come and get my wall repaired. And he says, okay, but that is not exactly what I am talking about here. What I said in the first line about something there is that doesn't love a wall, it's not the hunters, it's something else. And then he says, the gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. He says these gaps, these huge gaps through which two people can pass abreast, he says they are quite, mysterious, because nobody has seen these gaps being made. Nobody has heard, because these are stone boulders. When somebody takes a stone and moves it or puts it that side, there should be some kind of a noise, but nothing has been reported so far. Nobody has seen them made or heard them made. But every time when we come here in spring mending time, so after the winter season, it's the whole ground and everything is frozen, there is snow all over, and then comes the spring season. So it is during the spring season that the two neighbors, that is the speaker of the poem and the man who owns the farm on the other side, they come together, they fix a date, he says, but at spring mending time we find them there. Spring mending time, during the spring season, they find that these gaps are there. Who made them? Nobody knows. But invariably, every spring they find these gaps. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. And so he says that in the springtime he informs his neighbor who lives beyond the hill, and you can see the spelling of neighbor, N-E-I-G-H-B-O-R. Here it is the American spelling of neighbor. In British English we would insert a U after that O there, N-E-I-G-H-B-O-U-R. This is the American spelling, and Frost, being an American writer, he spells it this way. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill. So I inform my neighbor and we fix a date and we meet and we start walking from one end of the wall to the other line. We walk the line. So we start walking from one end to the other end. And as they go, they put back the boulders, because some boulders would have fallen this side. That's why he says, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. So the boulders that have fallen on my side, I would take it and put it back. The boulders on my neighbor's side, he would pick them and put it back. So they work in unison. They move along the line, picking up boulders, replacing them in their correct places. We keep the wall between us as we go. So there you can see the wall, the distance. It is there between us to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until the bags are turned. So he says some of these boulders have over the years changed in their shape. So some are loaves, like loaves, are rectangular shape, like you say a loaf of bread. It is rectangular in shape. So some of them are almost rectangular and some of them are almost round. So the act of balancing them on the wall without rolling off itself is, a kind of a trick. And that is why he says we have to use a spell to make them balance. Oftentimes they just somehow precariously balance the stone there, and they almost tell the stones, remain there at least till my back is turned, don't fall off. So very tenderly, very carefully they place these rules, they place these boulders or stones, because they are all of different shapes. And remember, I said earlier that there is no mortar or cement to fix them there. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to a little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. And he says that we wear our fingers, in the sense lifting these boulders, putting them in place. The tips of their fingers, maybe the nails, they get damaged, and maybe they get slightly bruised. And then he says this is just another kind of an outdoor game with one player on each side. He says it's nothing more. It doesn't really serve a purpose. That's what he means. Because this particular place where this wall is there, we don't actually need a wall there. And what does he mean by saying that? He is all pine and I am apple orchard. See, he says that I own an apple orchard and my neighbor's is a pine forest. Why would you need a border or a wall between these two? Because if both had apples, there might be quarrels about your apple trees and mine. But here, nothing of that sort would come up, because they are two entirely different categories of vegetation. And that is why he says we don't actually need a wall there. That it's just a game, this building the wall, the mending of the wall. It's an unnecessary activity, like a game that really has no purpose other than, an entertainment. So my apple trees, he is all pine and I am apple orchard. You know what orchard means. Orchard is a garden of fruit trees. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. So he says as much to his neighbor. He tells him, see, why do we need a wall here? My apple trees are never going to come that side and eat your pine cones. So then why do we need this wall here? And what does the neighbor say in reply? He says, good fences make good neighbors. He doesn't say anything more. He doesn't explain. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. It's always good to have a fence between neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. So he says, spring is the mischief in me. Spring is a season of new life, so much of joy and vivacity all around. And so he says, maybe it is the spring season that is making me mischievous. So he decides to pursue this argument. Maybe he asks him this question every time, and he always tells him that good fences make good neighbors. This time, because he is in a very mischievous and a very jolly mood, he decides to pursue the argument and make the neighbor think about this. So if I could put a notion in his head, and then he asks the question, why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. So he says, see, why do they make good neighbors? Especially in our case, there are no cows on that side or on my side. If there are cows, of course, there are chances of a quarrel breaking out, because a cow may come this side if there is no wall and eat your plants. It might destroy the crops that you have been trying to grow. But in this case, such a thing doesn't exist at all. There are no cows. there is no way in which something from that side can cause damage to something on this side, then why do we need this wall? And he says, before I built a wall, I did ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Such a sweet poem. I love this poem. And so he says that, I would like to know before building a wall, I'd really like to know what I am walling in, what am I keeping in, what am I safeguarding, what am I preserving, and what am I keeping away from me, what am I walling out. I'd like to get an answer to these questions, and to whom I was like to give offense. See, if something happens, like your cow damages something on the neighbor's farm, that will definitely give offense. Means it will hurt the other person. It will, foster ill feeling between the two families, the neighbors. So I would like to know, in this case, what am I trying to safeguard myself against? And he also says, something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. The first sentence, you remember, something there is that doesn't love a wall. Now he tells it, he voices it out and tells the neighbor, I say, there is something that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. So he says this to his neighbor, and he, in his mischievous mood, he also wants to say, he's tempted to say, this something might be elves. Now you know what elves and goblins and fairies are, all supernatural creatures, and so which is part of the countryside folklore. And so he says, maybe it is elves, but then he restrains himself from saying that because his neighbor is not a very jolly kind of a person, and so he doesn't come forth with this mischievous answer. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. So then he wishes that his neighbor would maybe come forward with an answer, and so he doesn't suggest anything. He just says that there is something that doesn't like walls. And he stands looking at the other man. The other person is not exactly giving him an answer. He watches the man on the other side, and he is picking the boulders, and he's walking towards the wall with those boulders in his hands. He's got 2 stones in his hands, in either of his hands. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not, okay. So he says, now as he stands and looks at this neighbor who is coming towards the wall with stones in his hands, he resembles, or the speaker feels that he resembles an old stone savage who's armed with stones, who's going to attack somebody, a primitive man with his primitive weapons. He says that the neighbor moves in darkness, and it is not just the darkness of the woods, because the trees and the shade of trees, it's the trees and the dense woods, apple trees on one side, pine trees on the other, all that definitely makes gives a feeling of darkness. But he says, I'm not referring to that darkness. He moves in a darkness not of woods only, but it is the darkness of his mind, in the sense that he is trying to say that his friend lives in the darkness of ignorance, or in the darkness of narrow-mindedness that doesn't allow him to come into the light of knowledge, that doesn't allow him to trust his neighbor. So the darkness of mistrust, suspicion, it is all that he means by the darkness here. So he moves in darkness, and then he will not go behind his father's saying. He likes, having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. So he says he will not go behind his father's saying. Now this behind can be interpreted 2 ways, I feel. One, he will not go behind in the sense he will never try to think of what exactly is meant by, what is the meaning behind good fences make good neighbors? Does it really hold any water? Is there any sense in saying that good fences make good neighbors? So he will not go behind it to find whether there is any meaning in it. That is one way you can look at it. And then another thing also might be that he would not go behind in the sense that he would not go against his father's, because he got it handed down from his father, the old adage that good fences make good neighbors. So he will not go against the tradition, he will not violate the custom, and so he is very, very traditional. And maybe that is what he means by saying he will not go behind his father's saying. And then he simply repeats, he doesn't give any explanation, he simply repeats as though he is very much convinced by what he is saying. He says once again, good fences make good neighbors. Okay, so that is the end of the poem. Now when you look at it from the very, very peripheral level, you can see that there is nothing more to it than just you might feel that there is nothing more to it than two men mending a wall which stretches in between them. And so it is the annual repair of fences. So one on this side, the other on that side, and as they go, they put back the boulders, they mend the wall, as the title says, mending walls, because one of them firmly believes that good fences make good neighbors. And so that is one level of meaning. And now looking at it, what does this man mean by saying good fences make good neighbors? So maybe he says that it is always better to keep a distance between people, because too much of familiarity might cause trouble. Like you must have heard of this saying, familiarity breeds contempt. So if you get too close to people, when you know too much about them, it might change your impression about the person. The person, when you see a person from a distance, you don't know much about him, and so maybe you have a good feeling about him because you don't know much about him. But when you get to know a person up close, you might learn more about his character, about something unpleasant in the way he behaves, and all that might actually sour the relationship. That is one. And again, when you are very close to somebody, little things can cause misunderstandings. That is also another way of looking at it, because you oftentimes find that best friends sometimes have fights and misunderstandings that makes them the worst enemies. So it is always safe to keep a distance between people. So that might be the reason which can be said in defense of this statement, good fences make good neighbors. Now looking at it, the opposing side. Now here you have this man on the other side of the fence who moves in darkness like an old Stone Age savage. So that man represents the traditional old-fashioned people who believe in these wise sayings that have been time tested. Whereas on this side you have the speaker, who might be a younger man, who is more broad-minded, who has a more cosmopolitan view of this world, who doesn't believe in forging distances between people, who doesn't believe in maintaining distances between people, who feels that walls are totally unnecessary. And that brings us to another interpretation of walls, as walls as something that divides men from one another and that keeps people away. It can be the walls of religion, it can be the walls of nationality, of race, color, gender, all these are walls that divide people. So the wall here symbolizes any of these ideas that divide people, that um, creates a rift between people, saying that you don't belong here, that you are different from me. So all these ideas are brought together in this wall, and this reminds me of a poem from the Gitanjali, song 35 from Gitanjali, in which Tagore says, it is this poem that begins with the line, where the mind is without fear. So here he says, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, and this sentence in particular, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. And I'm just skipping the remaining lines and going on to the last line. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. So Tagore too, Rabindranath Tagore too, in this particular poem, dreams of a world which is not broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. Now, what are these narrow domestic walls? It is the wall of, these are the walls of privilege, the walls of power, the walls of wealth, the walls of religion, the walls of caste, in the special case of India, the walls of race, the walls of ethnic groups that's already mentioned as races. So all these walls divide the world into fragments, and it might be these walls that Frost is referring to. Do we really need walls that always separate people? Why can't we think of a world without walls? That again reminds me of this organization called the Doctors Without Borders, an organization, a voluntary organization that takes medical aid into strife-ridden areas of the world when there is a famine or when there is a civil war or war itself, and when people are forced to run away from their homes. So these Doctors with Borders, the MSF, or the Médecins Sans Frontières, so that organization, and how apt the title is, Doctors Without Borders. So that also makes us think, are borders really necessary? Can't are human beings not sensible enough to live without borders? To think of all human beings as one single race? Why can't we think of all human beings all over the world as one clan, as one race that might have differences, but not really differences that need to be walled out? That is a question that this poem raises. Do we really need walls? So, a poem that is seemingly very innocent, just about a wall that is being mended, but then it makes us think about so many things. Such a relevant poem in these times when, in spite of all the knowledge that human beings have acquired, in spite of having schools and colleges everywhere, in spite of us gaining education, in spite of all this, we live in a world in which people are being divided, are differentiated from each other on flimsy grounds. And so this poem, it prompts us to give some serious thought into this idea of a world without borders, of a world where all of us think of each other as one family, which is not divided by any external force.